think we're ready for some more GPS information. Professor King is going to introduce us to use of live GPS data.
Thank you. This draws on work that John Peters and I have been doing over the past couple of years, and also some of the work that we've been doing, John and I, with Matt Doss. And I'm a bit of an odd duck here. I'm not a regulator, and I'm not an economist. I'm an urban planner. And some of what I'm going to bring up in my talk is going to challenge some of what we've heard earlier, because I'm approaching taxi usage as from a different perspective. And what I'm working through on this research that I'm doing and that John and I are doing is thinking about where taxis fit within the transportation planning system. And for the most part, I think it's not just up to as researchers, but up to the industry to stick your foot in the door for transportation planning overall, because I think that that there's strong interest, but there's also the taxis and other for-hire services fill an important niche in transportation planning. So I'm going to talk about how the GPS data can help and open the door for some new partnerships. So the taxi data is an opportunity. We know much, much more about the vehicles moving around than we ever did. We don't know necessarily a lot more about the passengers. We know a fair amount about the passengers, such as where they're being picked up and where they're being dropped off. We don't know about their socioeconomic characteristics. From other travel surveys and data that's been collected over the years, we know that taxis are not just a travel mode for the rich. If you divide income into quintiles, taxi usage is about the same for the number of trips per capita for the lowest income quintile and the highest income quintile. There's a real opportunity for taxi services to improve the equitable distribution of transportation services. And this is why, as a planner, I'm very concerned about these issues. That taxis are not just something for getting from the airport to downtown, but they're a critical piece of the transport system. And transport planning generally ignores taxi cabs. I went through all of my graduate studies without ever having to sit through a lecture on taxi cabs. And this is a real problem. Taxis is certainly where I am in New York, but I think everywhere, they are not a hidden source of transportation. They're a critical source of transportation. And many of you as regulators and as people who are really framing the industry, you're not invited into the planning system. You're not sitting on transit boards. You're not part of the conversation. You're not part of the conversation about funding, about planning, about how to fit in with the overall transportation plans of cities and regions. And I think that that's a real problem. That, we're talking about John was talking about just the amount of fraud in New York City, or potential fraud. Just those potentially fraudulent trips in New York are the equivalent of many mid-sized cities' bus systems, as far as ridership goes, right? I mean, this is a big issue. The GPS data, one of the reasons that one of the opportunities that we have right now is there's a lot of enthusiasm about taxi cabs, largely driven by the apps and the GPS data. That suddenly a new world has opened up, and there's all kinds of people who are interested in this. And planning, we have to be careful of people who are traditionally not planners co-opting many of the things that we're interested in pursuing and much of the work that we've done. I think as regulators, you also need to be concerned about this. Many of the apps, many of the data-driven projects are being driven by computer scientists and physicists and others who are very, very good at dealing with large data sets, but may not lack the theory and experience that the regulators and researchers bring. And I think that that's something that everybody in this room needs to be focused on. And then the last thing that I'll bring up in this is that there's opportunity for new alliances. That that the regulators and the taxi drivers being brought into the transportation planning process, there are far, far more natural alliances that are not being realized right now. And I'll talk about those more in a bit, but there's far more opportunity to get much more popular and political support for reform, if reform is what you want, and I certainly have ideas about why I'm interested in certain types of taxi reform. Now, Ray brought up Bruce Scholler's work on that discounted the role of population in the total number of medallions, and and Bruce's work is very good. But I do want to highlight, this is a table from a paper that we did last year of the change in taxis compared with the population from 1970 to 2010. Now, 1970 is about the year that you could consider the contemporary transportation planning and finance and investment strategies have been relatively constant since then. We've had a lot of change in our urban population and our regional populations, but there really is no relationship between the change in taxi coverage to the change in population. Now, this could be good or bad, but we would at least expect that there should be some type of connection. That many of the cities where we've seen a decrease in the total number of taxis have actually seen an increase in population and back and forth. And this suggests to me, there's nothing conclusive about this, but it suggests to me that taxis are not being fully considered as part of our overall transportation system. We've invested a lot in transit. We've invested a lot in rail transit and expanding rail and bus systems. But we haven't done the same for the complementary aspects of transportation. One of the things that Bruce Scholler's paper does highlight is there's a strong relationship between transit ridership, and in his paper specifically subway ridership, and taxi usage. That taxis are a way to complement the transit system. And we haven't done that in planning, and we haven't recognized that within the context of transportation policy. There have been some attempts over the years to involve jitneys and minibuses, which are generally regulated under the taxi and limousine commissions. In nearly all cases, these projects have failed. I've done some work recently on some recent attempts in New York City. It's a paper in process on this. And what we can say about trying to convert minibuses into a conventional transit system is that they're substantively different operations. They often serve niche markets that a transit agency can't serve or won't serve. For instance, in New York City, one of the most popular jitney markets is a series of vans that goes from Chinatown to Chinatown to Chinatown. And this is a market that it doesn't necessarily warrant an entire bus line or a rail line, but it's the kind of niche market that creative regulations within the taxi industry can help serve and really improve the lives for many people. So how might taxis fit into conventional transport planning? There's no doubt, it's absolutely true, that transport is a derived demand. And I'll argue sort of separately from just taxis that planners have tended to forget that, where there's far too much emphasis on speculative investment. But the way the conventional transport planning model works is planners try and figure out what's the mode shift or the mode share between transit and autos. And then they try and estimate the least cost options between two analysis zones, multiple analysis zones. And so they refer to trip generation. Specific types of business types, building types will generate a certain number of trips. What's the distribution of those trips? Where are they going? Then the mode split, the mode choice, which is almost entirely auto or bus, or auto or transit. And then route assignment, and then the route assignment is used to plan where the road should be expanded, where the bus line should go, where the rail line should go. Now, this locks in spatially where the demand was observed, or where the demand was expected to be observed. Now, taxis, this is an image, now taxis have what I refer to as asymmetric demand. You see lots and lots of one-way trips. These are very, very difficult to model. Now, though taxis are a low share of the overall travel, their origins and destinations are very unique. That people are taking taxi trips from places and to places that they're not necessarily going to be taking the bus, they're not necessarily going to be driving. One of the things that taxis offer, and they do this more than car share, they do this more than conventional transit planning, is that taxis allow you to leave your house by one mode, conduct your business by another mode, and come back to your home by yet another mode. The way we generally consider transport planning is if you leave your home as a driver, you're a driver the entire trip. If you leave your home as a transit rider, you're a transit rider the entire trip, or the entire journey, I should say. Whereas taxis allow for trip-based mode choice. This is a critical aspect for creating livable communities, sustainable transportation, many of the more equitable distribution of resources, where taxis can serve specific trips, and even low-income people, when they have, they will have very high value of trips. Taxi services in New York City, for instance, whether it's the yellow cab or some of the outer borough cabs, are the difference between low-income households being able to have one job and two jobs, because their buses aren't going to be able to get them from their first shift to their second shift. But having a taxi, having a black car, having a jitney available allows them to actually have improve their standard of living. Now this is the image that John showed earlier. But this is looking at the origins and destinations, and what you see is all these destinations, we don't know anything about what the potential origins are in those locations. But this does not fit in with a conventional transportation model. We have concentrated origins, we have spread out destinations, and we know that all of those red dots that don't have green dots associated with them spatially came from somewhere where those people they didn't drive to their origin. Right? They got there some other way. In this case, what we're seeing with the spread of the dots, of the red dots, the destinations in particular, is that taxis are extending the transit system. So people are choosing to come into the central city, into the core, however they get there, and then they're coming back out into the outer boroughs some other way. And this type of spatial dispersion is really critical, and it's something that we can do with the GPS data. That even as we're looking at the optimal number of medallions, the optimal number of taxis, we can't look at that just as a citywide or a region-wide setup. We don't know in these areas where you have more destinations and origins. We simply don't know what the taxi market would look like if yellow cabs were available in those markets, because they're not. So it presents a real challenge to how do we incorporate this, and how can we be, both as researchers and as regulators, how can we be flexible enough to allow for some creative approaches. And so this gets into some natural allies, even though nobody knows that these are natural allies. People who are advocating for livable streets are a natural ally of the taxi business. And this is a difficult conversation to have, and I've certainly talked to people who advocate for livable streets, and they're very opposed to taxis. They're opposed to taxis because they see them as a substitute for private cars, and they're taking people away from transit. And I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. The taxis allow people, especially on the margin, they allow people to stay away from auto ownership and auto usage and rely on a robust transit system. And it's important to stress that taxis are not just something for the rich. Transit advocates should transit advocates should be very disappointed with the overall performance of the transit systems. Transit productivity has declined even though we've been spending more and more money on it. And we need to look at what are the complementary aspects to our transport planning and operations that we can use to increase the productivity of our transit systems. And the evidence is fairly overwhelming that taxis are a part of that. Not 90%, but a part. ADA enforcement is an enormous issue that we've talked about. The people who advocate for disability rights should be natural allies of the taxi industry. This is a way to improve access for many individuals and improve taxi services. And then people who advocate for parking reform. Now, I'm certainly one of them. People who want to see a reduction in minimum parking requirements, who want to decouple parking, the required parking with individual buildings. You know, not anti-parking, but there's no reason that just because you want to build a building, I'm going to tell you how much parking you need. You know, just like we don't know exactly how many taxi cabs are optimal. We don't know how many parking spots are optimal, but right now the city is very specifically saying how many parking spaces are associated with each and every land use. And so if we want to change that, we have to provide additional alternatives for travel, and taxis are an enormous, enormous opportunity for that. So that's sort of a broad brush thought about where taxis should be positioning themselves from the perspective of a planner. You know, as I'm working with cities, as I'm working with communities, I advocate for more taxis, more jitneys, more minibuses, things like that. And so some of the areas of research that are present now and where I think certainly we as researchers are going and where I would like to have some input from the regulators, the GPS data is extremely rich, but it's limited to vehicle information. We need to figure out how to get more information about the riders. More information about who's riding taxis, why they're taking taxis. You know, we know where they're going, but we don't know many of the circumstances associated with it. We need to do more research on multimodal journeys. You know, outside of U.S. cities, in U.S. cities, travel is dominated by auto, and transport policy is dominated by the idea that you're either driving or you're on transit. In Asian cities, in European cities, and many other cities around the world, the transport planning is not treated as a binary choice. That people are making choices based on their on individual trip characteristics. And taxi services are a way to improve the overall supply of transport opportunities that people will be able to take advantage of. And regulations that follow how taxi systems are used rather than force how systems should be used. We can look at the data, and this is something that everybody else has said as well, we can look at the data and help plan our services. We can help spatially allocate taxi services if that's what's required. We can help identify areas of fraud or potential fraud. We can identify areas that are being relatively underserved. And so we can use the data to really improve the planning operations of taxis. And I think part of that is the industry and the regulators need to be more, getting back to it, they need to be more proactive on being part of the transportation planning process. It needs to not be a us versus them. It needs to be a we're all in this together trying to create transportation services that serve the people. You know, as Ray brought up right off the bat, you know, taxi services are there to serve the public, and we need to be cognizant of that first and foremost. And I think that there's a real opportunity for the taxi regulators to improve transportation planning overall by being involved. And I will leave it at that.